Harlan Fenwick was staking tomato plants along a waist-high cedar garden fence on his own farm, land that had never belonged to any homeowners association a single day in its 110-year history, when a certified letter arrived citing him for a corridor aesthetic violation and demanding $13,600 in fines from Millbrook Crossing HOA, a community he had never joined, never signed an agreement with, and never once received a single service from. Harlan read the letter twice, set it on his porch rail, and walked down to the one thing Millbrook Crossing needed more than any bylaw ever would: the 70-year-old bridge his grandfather built across Cedar Creek, the only crossing connecting their entire subdivision to town. Stay with Harlan as one absurd fine unravels into the discovery of exactly why HOA President Vivian Renshaw suddenly cared so much about a garden fence she had never once mentioned in 4 years. Harlan Fenwick was 58 years old, a third-generation farmer running 340 acres that had been in his family since before Millbrook Crossing existed, back when the land across the creek was just undeveloped hillside. When the subdivision broke ground 22 years earlier, the developer had approached Harlan's father for permission to use the only viable creek crossing for miles, a private bridge his grandfather had built decades before for moving cattle and equipment. Harlan's father agreed, on the condition that the arrangement be formalized in a recorded shared corridor easement. Millbrook Crossing residents could use the bridge and the gravel access road leading to it in exchange for an annual maintenance contribution, while the Fenwick family retained full ownership, explicit rights to close the bridge for up to 72 hours annually for agricultural or maintenance needs, and, critically, a clause stating the family's farm itself remained entirely outside any HOA jurisdiction, covenant, or fee structure now or in the future. Vivian Renshaw, 55, had been Millbrook Crossing's HOA president for just under a year, having moved into the community after a career in commercial land development. Unlike previous board presidents who had treated the Fenwick easement as exactly what it was, a generous, clearly defined arrangement outside their authority, Vivian had spent months quietly studying county zoning maps of the corridor road and creek frontage, looking for any angle that might bring more of it under her control. Unable to find any legitimate basis to fine Harlan directly, Vivian invented one. A corridor aesthetic standards clause she drafted and pushed through a sparsely attended board vote, applying not to HOA members but broadly to any visible structure along the shared access corridor. A definition written specifically broad enough to snag Harlan's new garden fence, visible from the gravel road residents drove every day to reach the bridge. Harlan called the HOA office calmly, expecting a quick correction once someone realized his farm wasn't part of the association at all. Instead, he reached Vivian directly, who informed him, with practiced patience, that the corridor standards applied to any property visible from association infrastructure, regardless of ownership, and that the fine would stand unless he removed the fence within 15 days. "I farmed this land for 36 years, Harlan told her. "Nobody from your board has ever had a say in what I build on it, and nothing in my family's agreement with this community gives you that authority now." Vivian's response was clipped and rehearsed enough that Harlan suspected she'd said some version of it before. "The board's decision is final. I'd encourage you to pay it before penalties accrue." Harlan didn't argue further. He simply exercised the maintenance clause explicitly written into his family's own recorded easement, posting formal notice that the bridge would close for 72 hours starting that Friday for scheduled structural inspection and fence line repair work. Language pulled directly, word for word, from the agreement's own maintenance provision. With the bridge closed, Millbrook Crossing's only alternate route to town added a 45-minute detour along a winding 2-lane highway, and by Friday afternoon the HOA's community group chat had exploded with parents missing school pickups, a resident stuck at the hospital unable to get home to relieve a caregiver, and a small business owner who ran a home bakery watching a full weekend of delivery orders collapse. A retired nurse named Patricia Delmonico, who volunteered 3 mornings a week at the county clinic, posted that she'd had to cancel her shift entirely rather than risk the extra 90 minutes round trip on the highway detour, a message that got shared and reshared through the neighborhood faster than anything the board had posted in months. By Saturday morning, someone had printed out Harlan's original citation letter and taped it to the community mailbox kiosk with a single word written across it in red marker: "Why?" A handful of residents, including a soft-spoken accountant named Felix Okwosa who had lived in Millbrook Crossing since it was built, started asking a question in the group chat that made Vivian visibly uncomfortable when someone eventually showed her the thread. If the fence violation was serious enough to fine a non-member $13,600, why had no one on the board ever mentioned it before this year, and why had it suddenly become urgent the same month Vivian took over the presidency? Vivian, confident Harlan was bluffing or would cave under community pressure, told the board the closure was clearly retaliatory and legally unenforceable, and encouraged residents to simply drive across the bridge anyway. Advice that ended within hours, with a resident's SUV nearly sliding off the temporary barrier Harlan had installed, and a furious phone call from that resident directly to Vivian rather than to Harlan. Harlan, increasingly certain this had nothing to do with an actual aesthetic concern, retained a property attorney named Marcus Delgado, who requested the full history of Vivian's corridor standards vote and found it had been passed with only 3 of the 7 board members present, none of whom recalled being told the rule would apply to a non-member's private farm. Marcus's paralegal pulled county zoning correspondence and found something unusual. 3 months earlier, Vivian had personally filed a preliminary inquiry with the county planning office about the feasibility of a new, wider bridge crossing near the same stretch of creek, one that would require acquiring additional frontage directly from the Fenwick property. The inquiry included an attached engineering sketch showing a 2-lane concrete crossing nearly triple the width of Harlan's grandfather's original bridge, with an access road cutting directly through the pasture where Harlan currently grazed his small herd of dairy cows. Marcus printed the sketch and laid it beside a satellite image of Harlan's farm, tracing the proposed route with his finger. "This isn't a hypothetical," he told him. "Someone already paid an engineer to draw this." Marcus's paralegal then cross-referenced the inquiry's filing date against Millbrook Crossing's board meeting minutes and found the corridor standards vote had been scheduled a mere 9 days after Vivian's planning office visit. A timeline that, laid out on paper, looked far less like a genuine aesthetic concern and far more like the opening move of a plan that had already been quietly set in motion before Harlan ever received a single letter. Digging further, Marcus found that Vivian had been in private talks with a regional developer about a significantly expanded Millbrook Crossing Phase 2, requiring exactly the kind of wider, HOA-controlled bridge access that Harlan's family had never agreed to and had no reason to ever grant. A plan that depended entirely on either buying out the Fenwick easement outright or pressuring the family into selling under duress. The fabricated fence violation, Marcus explained to Harlan, wasn't really about a fence at all. It was the opening move in a pressure campaign designed to make his family's ownership of the bridge feel untenable, expensive, and adversarial enough that selling the easement rights to Vivian's development partner would start to look like the easier option. Rather than back off once residents began questioning the fine's legitimacy, Vivian escalated, sending Harlan a second citation for obstruction of community infrastructure during the closure window. A charge with no basis whatsoever in an easement that explicitly authorized exactly what he had done. With residents furious over the weekend's chaos and demanding answers, Vivian called an emergency board meeting to explain the fence fine. A meeting Harlan attended in person, alongside Marcus Delgado, who requested to speak during the public comment period. Marcus laid it out methodically for the packed room. The improperly passed corridor rule, the board members who never approved it being applied to non-members, Vivian's county planning inquiry, and the private development talks explicitly requiring expanded bridge access across Fenwick land, all times suspiciously close to a fabricated fine designed to make that land feel like more trouble than it was worth. He projected the engineering sketch onto the wall behind him, the proposed road cutting through Harlan's pasture in stark blue lines, and let the room sit with it in silence for a long moment before continuing. Felix Oquosa, sitting near the front, said what half the room was already thinking out loud. So this was never about a fence. Vivian attempted to characterize the planning inquiry as routine due diligence unrelated to any individual resident. An explanation that collapsed the moment Marcus produced an email from Vivian's development contact referencing getting the Fenwick situation resolved before we move forward with Phase 2. Dated the same week the corridor violation letter was mailed. The board voted that same night to rescind the corridor standards rule entirely, void both citations against Harlan, and remove Vivian from the presidency pending a formal ethics review. Harlan, on Marcus's advice, pursued a claim for wrongful citation and harassment, ultimately settling for full reimbursement of his legal costs. A formal written acknowledgement that his property remained entirely outside HOA jurisdiction, and a $95,000 payment covering damages tied to the improperly issued fines and the board's failure to exercise basic diligence before authorizing them. The development partner Vivian had been negotiating with quietly withdrew from the proposed Phase 2 expansion once the story broke, unwilling to be associated with a deal built on a fabricated code violation. And county records showed the wider bridge planning inquiry was formally closed without further action less than a month later. Millbrook Crossing's new board formally reaffirmed the original bridge easement exactly as written, publicly thanked Harlan for the 72 hours of legitimate closure that had, ironically, been entirely within his rights the whole time, and adopted a new policy requiring any rule affecting non-member property to receive full board approval and written legal review before ever being enforced. Weeks later, Harlan stood at the same garden fence, tying up the last of his tomato plants as a line of cars crossed the bridge into town, waving as they passed the way they always had before any of this started. He told a young reporter doing a follow-up story that he never once wanted to punish anyone by closing that bridge. He'd simply used the rights his grandfather had written into the agreement exactly the way he intended, to protect the one thing that had always been his to protect. What he hoped people took from it, he said, wasn't a story about revenge at all. It was a reminder that sometimes the quietest, most reasonable response to being pushed is simply refusing to be moved. If you've ever had someone try to weaponize against you, leave a comment below. Tell me what happened. Tell me how it ended. And if you enjoyed the story, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.